Hello, everybody. It is day 2 of our conversations. Kelly, I've now named this season 4, right? I'm using the language of today, season 4, episode 2. And we are so thrilled to talk about Arab American Heritage Month with 2 amazing educators, Dr. Sasan Jaba, who is, and you've got to explain what this is, a Pulitzer Fellow. What does that mean?
So Pulitzer has programs for educators that are this year, they have a different theme every year. So this year they focused on underrepresented stories, where they kind of immerse you with a bunch of journalists who do work internationally on reporting, and then they want you to turn that into something, a resource, or in our classrooms. Sorry, in our classrooms. You come up with a unit plan that you have to actually work into your classroom and students, and then it becomes like a model that is used in classrooms all over the world, with student samples and other things. And you then become kind of like it's a cohort and a part of a membership, where you're working with a group of teachers to train other teachers to integrate the Pulitzer resources, which are absolutely amazing. And I recommend every teacher look at them, because they are diversity and international and equity focused, and a lot of wonderful things that we're trying to do in classrooms today. So yeah, it's a whole year program that I've been a part of, meeting almost weekly and sometimes bi-weekly with different educators around the country.
Amazing. And I will link that in our Padlet, which lets people know the resources we talk about. But you have a long list of accomplishments, but one of them is that you're 2023 co-teacher of the year in Cook County, right? In Illinois. Can you talk about it? What do you teach? What is that?
I teach high school English, and I am one of the 10 or I think 13 finalists for Illinois State Teacher of the Year. So I'm hoping that announcement's going to be in the next 2 weeks. So I'm praying for it, because I will probably be the first Middle Eastern Teacher of the Year in the country nationally.
Wow.
I had that. So that's a huge thing for me, for my community, for a lot of us in a lot of different ways. So it's huge. So I'm hoping for that for all of us. But yeah, I teach high school English, and I've transformed my curriculum into a social justice curriculum. And I teach in a primarily minoritized school district. A lot of this kind of was born out of my own lived experiences, feeling invisible, going through K through college, all the way up through graduate school. I think the macroaggressions, I don't call them microaggressions because they're not small and they define your life in a lot of ways. So the macroaggressions were consistent and then continued throughout my professional career as an Arab and as a Muslim. And so I thought to myself, like, I wonder how my life would have been different if I was able to engage in conversations and be able to read the world differently. Like I learned that in graduate school. That's what I focused on, and my doctoral degree was focused on equity and the perceptions of inclusion and belonging of minoritized students in historically homogenous school districts. And so it just opened my eyes to story after story of students struggling in our school spaces. And so I thought to myself, how different would my life have been if I had the toolbox to be able to navigate that world at a younger age? And so I started to develop a curriculum that allowed me to do that with students at a high school level. And so we focus on learning how to interrogate our own identities and how to navigate critical conversations, and then think about what can we do with the information that we learn all through literature. And then the last part of the year is, now that we know, what are we going to do with what we know? And so I call my students scholar activists, because they educate themselves and immerse themselves in a world of understanding diversity, and then they have to act on what they know. And I feel like the students have, by the end of the year, I teach juniors primarily, and then I teach a senior class as well. And we do a research as a form of activism class as well. So how do we use research to really kind of claim our stories, but also highlight and focus on the things that minoritized groups are facing, because even academia is primarily, white, and the minoritized voices are invisible there as well. And so how can we, as a minoritized group, really elevate our voices in this area too? And because everything is based on research, how important is it for us to have a space here as well? And so they take that and they move it into action. But then I have kids who graduated from my class 5 or 6 years ago, who are now doing things in universities and have become professionals, and they're working and they're integrating all of these conversations into every space that they occupy. And so I say, and this is what my true belief is, that this is what's going to heal our country, right? If we have understanding and empathy towards each other, because it comes from a place of learning, right? Because a lot of the fear is elevated when people don't understand each other. And so that's why we're seeing a lot of the things that we're seeing in our world today. And so the antidote to fear is understanding, and that builds empathy. And then the other part of it is we have people who are actively engaged, and that's going to change the status quo. So I know that the next president is sitting in my classroom somewhere, not the next president, but a president in the future. They're sitting in my classroom, the Supreme Court judges. These are people who are going to go out into the world with the intention of changing it to make it better. And they have the understanding of what that means, what this country is built on, the beauty of that diversity and how to celebrate that and how to actually elevate and amplify the things that we are claiming to be what make us different from every other country in the world.
Beautifully said.
Thank you.
If every teacher that listened to this interview with you guys did something with Arab American Heritage Month, that's one step closer. But I also know that to do the kind of deep thinking you're doing in curriculum planning and creating a curriculum centered on equity and justice is brave all on its own in your school. And I can only imagine there's been some pushback and some challenges there. Yeah.
There's always pushback from every stakeholder group, right? Like there's pushback from colleagues, there's pushback from students, there's pushback from parents, there's always pushback. But,
wow.
I have to say that especially in the last few, especially post-COVID, and post George Floyd, and our students were sitting at home, glued to their screens, immersed in the conversation by default. They had no other choice but to be a part of it. But there is such a huge need and thirst and want and acceptance of the conversation among our youth, right? So I think I teach 120 kids a year. I have to say that at least 100 of them are already into the conversation once they walk into my classroom space. And my class is an American Lit class. They don't advertise it as a social justice class. So you end up in my class, you don't choose it, you end up in my class by default. And if you end up in my class, that's the conversation we're having. So it's not like kids are opting to be there. These are just random kids placed in my classroom every single year.
Wow. Boy, I could talk to you all day long, reforming American literature and the whole colleague question, because boy, did I get the pushback. I know exactly what you're talking about. You try to shift the conversation and you get a lot of no, not now. So thank you for your courage. And man, am I going to be hopeful that you will be the first teacher of the year. That would be just an incredible.
Thank you.
And with you is Zainab. And Zainab, I met at NCTE this fall. It was so funny because I was going to a Build Your Stack. And I knew you were going to be talking about literature that I didn't have enough of in my classroom. This was the one I was reading when I showed up at your session. And I thought, oh, I'm going to go sit and listen to her. And it was just powerful. And then we had dinner. And I think, Zainab, this is your third year of teaching, isn't it?
Yes, I'm about to wrap up the third year.
Yeah, and you're in Alief, Texas, and Texas teachers have been under fire. And I just think that you are unapologetically going to shift what's happening in classrooms because you believe so strongly in the need for change. You're also TCTELA, which is a huge organization, very powerful, and you're the high school, they're the secondary rep, right?
Yeah, I'm the high school section chair. It's a wonderful open space. It's definitely been interesting to see because, Selson and I, we actually met at the NCTE homecoming event they had this past summer. And I remember I attended with some other TCTLA members, and there's like this inside joke that when you're visibly Muslim and you wear a hijab, you're usually like the only one there. And that's been my experience as a student teacher, I think they got another one, but for as long as I can remember, I was the only visibly Muslim teacher on my campus. So whenever you go to these professional spaces and these events, you're usually the only one. And I remember I was sitting down with everyone else and I look over and I was like, oh my gosh, there's another one. And then everyone on my table was like, what do you mean? I'm like, look, there's another hijabi. It's like, and Selson had approached me. We were listening to Ruta Sepetys, and she had approached me afterwards. And we just got into conversation, and I just remember like listening to her talk about what she was working on and everything she had into play and into motion. And I literally remember turning to Selson, and I remember I turned and I said, and I was like, I have never met anyone like you, like me before. And I know it's a weird sentence. I was like, I have never, I remember she told me she had a consulting company. I was like, you have a consulting company? Like, I thought that was the coolest thing ever. Because all the people that were consultants did not look like me. She had mentioned, oh, I'm working on this, and I'm presenting at NCTE. Like, you need to come on, like, you need to do this, you need to do that. And it was just so empowering to have someone that looked like you, who had done all these things, empower you to like take charge. And no, by no means was anyone discouraging in TCTLA and in my professional organization spaces. I had a lot of support, but it was just so different to have someone who looked like you and had similar experiences to you to really like empower you to do so. Because for everything that I do, I'm always like, well, am I the only one like me that's doing all this? Like, I don't have anyone else. And in A-Leaf, we don't really have as many book challenges in my space. I know you've been to our school district. We're a very diverse, very small school district. And we are very aware of how important it is to be culturally relevant. However, it's definitely a work in progress. Like right now, I'm about to like actually reach out to my superintendent, but they haven't acknowledged Arab Heritage Month here. And it hasn't been done in the past. And I think that's something that we need to regulate, because we have a lot of Arab students here. I know that they're very vigilant about Ramadan. And so that announcement did go out. We serve one of the largest Muslim populations in the country. And with book banning and all that, A-Leaf isn't directly affected. I haven't had anyone come in and ask me to take a book off my shelf, but like everyone's heard of other school districts. We're 20 minutes away from Katy. And that's like the biggest school district that we hear about the most. They're literally north of us.
Yeah.
And it's, I know teachers that teach over there and they don't like it either. There is a small population that is for it, and, they're very rigid in those beliefs. But I think Texas gets a bad rep that all teachers are just like for this. And we're really not. Like, a lot of teachers are livid. While there isn't book banning happening in other neighboring Houston school districts, they're having to keep a live record of every non-school issued book to the school. They have to report that to the parents. And I have a classroom library checkout system because my library is huge, but I wouldn't want to share that. I'm like, I don't understand. If you want your kids to come in and see what options I have, by all means, I'll share that list. But to provide that list and to prohibit these conversations that Selson touched on that are so important on having. And if we want to empower our students to be scholar activists and to go out into the real world and ask questions and want to learn and want to empathize and expose themselves to other people that don't share their experiences, they have to have a resource for that. And what better way than the books that we have in our classrooms?
Oh, that's huge. That's so true. But I wanted to just dig in for a minute here on not every Arab is a Muslim, for one. There are so many like misconceptions that I'd like to just spend a minute with. So could either of you talk about just what it is that teachers and a primarily white population, what is it, 82% white women is the teaching force in our country, right?
And the crazy thing is Arabs are actually classified as white here in the States. We when in Texas, you do have to report your demographics as an educator, and there was no Middle Eastern or an Arab or someone from the North African region. It was just white. And in parentheses, it'll say includes Arabs and Middle Easterns. And so I'm part of that 83%, unfortunately. But yeah, if you were to walk my campus, I'm like, no, I'm not really part of that percentage.
Yeah.
It's part of the invisibility, I think. That's what it is, right? Because you're invisible in the census, and that then leads to you're sitting in data conversation after data conversation. I live in the largest Arab population in the country right now, statistically, in Illinois. And we have districts that are almost completely Arab in areas where they're concentrated because of the redlining here. It's very, very segregated. And so you have districts that are almost completely Arab, with very few teachers that are Arab but look like me and Zainab, with a population of kids that are. And you'll sit in I worked in a district like that, and we sat in data meeting after data meeting, and never did the Arab students as a subgroup ever come up unless they were either in SPED or in ELL. So because of ESSA, right, focusing on subgroups and growth of students in subgroups, then all of a sudden these kids become invisible. Yet through my research, I found that they were hyper visible when it came to the bullying, the marginalization, the like anti-Arab and anti-Islamic sentiment. And because the two identities are often conflated, people can't tell the difference between them. And so anybody who's Arab or Muslim or Arab or Muslim looking, right, is often grouped into that category and treated the same way. And even the research shows like 1 in 3 students is bullied by a teacher. of Arab students by a teacher.
Mm.
And so that statistic, I always start, whenever I'm talking about Arab students, I always start with that statistic, because when we think about an Arab adolescent, right, that's a person who's already facing all of the self-concept questions, all of the identity search, the adolescent, they want to assimilate and fit, right? They want to belong, because that's a natural human thing, and especially in a school space. So they're facing all of that other stuff that most other kids are facing already. And then to add that extra layer of being completely misunderstood, having no representation whatsoever, and then being bullied by another educator. It's a really difficult place to be in. And then we want to wonder why, there's like, they're at the margins, even academically, often. I hear teachers in some of these schools saying like, well, the Arab boys particularly are so misbehaved. And it's like, yes, they feel invisible. They feel like they're really misunderstood, and kids will act up when they feel like they're invisible and they want to get that attention. So that's a reaction. Oftentimes, we need to look at why that is. And it's definitely a question that needs to be asked. But there's just so much when you're sitting in, we did a quick kind of informal survey to see what schools are teaching that have a high concentration of Arab students. And most schools are teaching the kite runner. And so Zainab and I did a session called Not the Kite Runner for TCTLA, because it's like, please choose something else, because Khaled Hosseini is not an Arab. And if we want to talk about being culturally responsive, you're immersing kids in stereotypes of themselves in classrooms, which is divisive not only to those students, but to every other student who that becomes the only window they have into who Arabs are. And then if we want to talk about it being responsive to Muslim students, he represents a extremist form of Islam, right? That's what's represented in the novel. He doesn't represent that, but what he's talking about in the novel is an extremist form of Islam. So it's not responsive to that either. Mm-hmm. So the book itself is just reinforcing the fear factor that the media and the West has created around Arab and Muslim identities, and doesn't do anything to really be responsive to anyone. So why are we teaching it in schools that have a heavy concentration of Arab and Muslim students? I can't understand that.
So yeah. your idea that a lot of this is rooted in not understanding, not recognizing, the other or difference, so if not Kite Runner, then all four of us believe that the world can change through books. Can we talk about some books that would be valuable for teachers to add to their classroom libraries?
Yeah, of course. Zainab, you can take that one.
I would just like to add on to what Selson said before I get into the books, is that when you're the only one, you don't have a teacher advocate that looks like you become like that one window. And then as a young adolescent, you're having to be the spokesperson in regards to that topic. And sometimes when you're not taught and equipped with those tools, like you're 15, 16, I was 9 and having to advocate for why you do certain things. And so how is that culturally relevant? I just want to add on to the statistic that 1 in 3 Arab students will be bullied by their teacher. For me, it was 3rd grade. Wow. I was 8. And while my teacher was very aware that I was Arab, because my mom would come pick me up, I had a very Arabic name, Zainab. My identity wasn't as affirming to her until later that school year when I turned 9 and I started wearing my hijab. And I remember walking into class that one day, and she looked at me, and that is a look that like I will never forget. That's deeply cemented in my brain forever. And I became the advocate. Why are you fasting? What is Ramadan? Why do you cover your hair? Why is that a thing? And, my peers would ask me, and, we're elementary kids, so they're still open to asking questions and learning. But I feel as we get older and we get into high school, I feel that if we don't have enough teachers that are giving these kids tools, just like Selson mentioned earlier, it becomes a really harmful situation for that student because they're having to advocate. I'm very grateful because I have a lot of Muslim, and I have maybe 1 Arab student this year, but I have a lot of Muslim students, and they really appreciated having someone mention that Ramadan was happening and what to expect, because then they were able to add into the conversation. But again, not every Muslim is Arab, but that 1 Arab student appreciates the fact that when he's talking about something that's relevant to his culture, because there are different kinds of Arabs. So my Lebanese culture may be different than his Iraqi culture to Selson's Palestinian culture. I'm able to relate to that, and we're able to like draw in on conversation. A couple of books that I have on me right now that I'd love to share. This is As Long as the Lemon Tree Grows. Sosan, I know, has already read this. I have not. Sosan, would you like to give your little spill on it?
I'm just going to say it's probably the best book I've ever read to date. It really is. I couldn't put it down. It was amazing. Just a really, really accurate painting of Syria today and the war in Syria and the human experience of Syrians that we don't often talk about because they're Arab. Like, we talk about so much of the tragedy that's happening in different parts of the world, but unfortunately, even on mainstream news, the Arab narrative is often muffled and silent. So this is a beautiful, I think, picture into Syria in its current form today.
And I would like to add Other Words for Home by Jasmine Morga. I don't have the copy on me right now, but it's written in verse, and it's another outlook into what it's like to be a Syrian refugee assimilating into America and having to grow up, and a coming of age story. And it's just absolutely beautiful.
And that one is middle schoolish for me,
Yes.
right? And what would you say lemon grows, as long as the lemon tree grows?
Definitely high school. I would even say, if you have Syrian students, it's probably not a book that I would teach them, because it might be a trigger to a lot of kids. It's very graphic. And so I would be careful where I put it. It's a good book to read. I think if you teach Syrian students, you need to read it, especially if you're like where I live in Illinois, we have a huge population of Syrian refugees. And if you want to understand the trauma that they come from, this is a book that everybody who's teaching Syrian refugees needs to read. But I would be mindful of where I put it, because it is quite graphic.
Such a good caveat there. I also think, though, that so many of us who teach in predominantly white states like New Hampshire also need those books.
Absolutely.
My students need to be educated across cultures. What else you got, Zainab?
Well, since we're talking about Syrians, I also have The Next New Syrian Girl. This is a newly released YA novel. I haven't had the chance to read it quite yet, but it basically follows two new girls. So you have one girl who's the only, as far as she knows, the only Syrian girl at her school. She's grown up in America. And then on the other end, we have a Syrian refugee that comes in, and she now becomes the next new Syrian girl. And it's an interesting side-by-side comparison of what it's like to grow up Syrian in different contexts, but also to have different experiences. Because not every single person's story, just because they're Arab, is the same. I know Sausan mentioned this on one of her blog posts for 30 Days of Arab Voices, about how, I can't represent all the Arab women or all the Muslim women out there, but I can represent my own story. This is how I'm fighting back, which I think is just beautiful. The next book I have is Mirage by Sumaya Dawood. Sumaya is Moroccan. I absolutely love this book, not just because it's purple, but it is a fantasy, and it has a lot of Arab and predominantly North African references and traditions that are mentioned. There's Arabic in here. It was interesting to see the different dialect of Arabic that was used, because it was very different than mine. And when I met Sumaya, I believe at the North Texas Teen Book Festival, it was just a wonderful conversation. I absolutely loved it. If you have any fantasy lovers, this is definitely for them. I believe the sequel came out last year. I haven't had a chance to read it, but the sequel is also out. And then right now what I have on me is Huda F. Are You by Huda Fahmy. So I have Huda's other books. Yes, I'm hot in this, The Hilarious Truth of Life in a Hijab, where she talks about being Egyptian. She talks about being Muslim, visibly Muslim, and her experience, in general, in different contexts and in different spaces. But this one in particular, I think it touches on a little bit what Selson and I were talking about, is what happens when you're a visibly Muslim Arab and you're the only visibly Muslim Arab at your school, versus what it's like to go to a predominantly Muslim and or Arab school. And Huda follows this narrative. She's like, how do you define yourself? Because again, it's a very harmful narrative when we sum all these kids up together and just label them as one thing. How do you fit in? How do you assimilate when everyone else around you does look like you and you want to be seen? And I think it just touches back on the fact that, as a, I don't want to say erased, but we're hidden as an ethnicity that is hidden or is we're trying to cover it. It's a nice reminder of we just want to fit in, and our kids just want to be seen. It's, it's told in, it's a graphic novel, it's funny, but there's a lot of truth in it. And I think it's a really good conversation starter to have with our students.
Yeah, I guess it fit in, but without giving up all of your identity markers and creating that sense of duality, I think, right?
Right, 100%.
I'm gonna add a couple more. I don't have them
Yeah.
on me. I'm not cool like Zainab, but Tasting the Sky by Ibtisam Barakat is absolutely one of my favorites. I think elevating, so there's an additional layer. It's difficult to be Arab in America today more than ever, especially with a lot of the bans and the Patriot Act and 9/11 and all of these different things like politically that are happening. I think that the fear around Arab and Muslim bodies has been elevated. Today, I have a 25-year-old daughter, Zainab's age, and I have a daughter that's 16. And I think that my youngest daughter is seeing a lot more anti-Arab aggression today than my older daughter did, and she was, younger around 9/11. And so it's a testament to the growing anti-Arab and anti-Islamic sentiment in our country for a lot of different reasons. So I think it's a lot more difficult to be a Palestinian Arab because of the stigmas around being Palestinian and because of the bipartisan support of America to Israel without really understanding the context there. And so there's an extra layer of dehumanization that exists around Palestinians. And that's something that I found a lot in my research, that at the youngest ages, kids that are Palestinian struggle more to claim their identity than other kids. And so I'm very big on trying to always advocate for the inclusion of Palestinian texts that are indicative of the experience of the Palestinian people in Palestine. So Ibtisam Barakat, it's a memoir, and it's her own story as a refugee of the 1963 war. And it's a middle school book, so it's a great read. It's a war refugee experience, but it's not so heavy that I think it would be too much for kids. And she has a sequel of it, Balcony on the Moon, and it's a really great read. It's just, she talks about also the beauty of how being a writer and learning how to read and write literally saved her from her own depression and from everything else. It became her voice, because after she was displaced and her family was separated, she didn't talk for a long time. She lost her ability to speak and verbalize even. And so writing became her outlet. So it's a really powerful text to talk about the beauty and the writing, the healing in writing, but also just a story that we don't often hear. I think Susan Abul Hawa, Mornings in Jenin, I think that's probably the most accurate mirror for my family's experience. It traces a family experience for like 4 generations of Palestinians and how they end up in America. So it's a beautiful, beautiful novel, like just poetic. It's probably one of the best books I've read. And I have to say too, like poetry is very much a part of the Arab culture. So there's tons of poetry. Naomi Shihab Nye is a Palestinian writer and a poet. Her poetry is absolutely beautiful. In a lot of it, she doesn't explicitly talk about the Arab experience, but she's referencing it. Mahmoud Darwish has a lot of translated poetry, and he is probably the father of poetry in the Palestinian world. His poetry is absolutely beautiful, and talks about the right to return and kind of the refugee experience and what it's like growing up in war. So those are some of the poets that I think. And then They Called Me Lioness is one of the more contemporary Palestinian texts. That's also a memoir, and it's a female protagonist, which I absolutely love and I think is super important too, because of the stereotype that Arab women are weak or dominated. And she is a teenage powerhouse. And so I think it's a really important window into the reality of Arab women as leaders in the occupation, leaders in the home, leaders in a bunch of different contexts, that really does dismantle the stereotype around Arab women particularly. So I really love that text. And it also, the authors do a really good job of educating with the political movements that really led to Palestine being what it is today. So I think it's a really informative text if people don't have any understanding about Palestine. It's a really great text. It tells a great story, but it also integrates a lot of education in there as well. So those are some of my favorites, I think, that are important.
Wow. Just one thought is that if all of us, all the educators, read one of these books this month, right, as it'd be on your desk and you'd be learning yourself, because I think we're all afraid of making mistakes about what is the difference between a Palestinian experience as an Arab and Zainab's experience, right? And that idea that we have so much to learn ourselves can be mitigated by reading that first book. And then the idea that you bring in poetry, it's National Poetry Month, and you begin to stand before kids and say, we all have a lot to learn, including me. And here's where we're going to start. That's just so powerful to listen to both of you.
I was thinking as I was listening, Penny and I are in a book club with some other friends,
Mhm.
that As Long as the Lemon Tree Grows should be
Absolutely.
our next
Like
read.
Nice.
I'm also just struck listening to both of you, that the counter narrative has to come, right? It has to come. And you know, Sasson, what I'm hearing from you is it's more systematic. You know, and Penny and I have talked about this, and we're going to share some of this maybe later, but I'm working in Anaheim because I don't think it should be just, you know, brave teachers like Zainab, right? I think there needs to be systems. There needs to be school systems that say we honor diverse books, we honor diverse cultures. And you know, I just think that that rebound is coming. And when I hear the two of you, it gives me hope.
I hope so, because I have to say, like, some of my most difficult experiences come from professionals in a professional setting. So like I think I've been called a terrorist by teachers. I've had an educator walk into my classroom, put her hand on my shoulder and ask me how I felt after what my people did in France, referencing an ISIS bombing. And this is an educator that teaches in a school with kids that look like me. I've had an educator come tell me my Palestinian identity was offensive if I could tone it down. So I've had a multitude of experiences from professionals who teach kids who look like me. So I think the biggest thing that we need to start doing before we can even talk about integrating these texts, because I've seen the worst harm happen when teachers try to integrate these texts without fully understanding how to contextualize these texts, right? And how to really ground them in understanding. The Kite Runner is a beautiful piece of literature if we want to talk about literature as like, if we want to teach kids how to write, it's a beautiful piece of literature. But if we're not contextualizing how the Kite Runner came out right after 9/11 and really added to a culture of fear and made its fame because that's what people needed to hear in that moment and wanted to hear in that moment, and we're not teaching how it is harmful and damaging in a lot of ways because it contributes to what people think they know about who we are, then we're not teaching it, right? We're not really teaching it. So how can we do that if so many of our educators have that misunderstanding? So I think it requires us, because curriculum is written in that way as well. In so many schools, we're all socialized by the same curriculum. It requires teachers to do a lot of unlearning. And with technology today, I think one of the biggest things, like I teach in a primarily Latinx community. One of the things that we do is I connect the students to communities, and I bring in speakers that look different, and I connect them to communities that are different, because although if you ask many of the teachers, they'll say our building is diverse. It's not. Our students that are Arab, Asian, and Black are living in a third space. They're completely invisible in our building because they're in small in number. And even when we're attempting to be culturally responsive, we're often meeting the needs of the majority, the minoritized majority, not our students that exist in small numbers. If you have one student who exists, every student should feel like they are important enough to be seen and to feel like they're understood. So technology gives us an opportunity to really connect them to these diverse communities. And we have an opportunity too, to really co-design with students, all students, so that you're not singling out these students that exist in small populations and getting them to elevate their voices. So they're creating those mirrors and those windows for each other, right? Like if I'm creating a text about myself, and that's one thing that's really important in my class, we have a read one, write one. So they read a poem and they write a poem, and their poem has to be based on their experiences. So if every student is sharing a poem that's based on their experience, by default, we're learning about everybody in that space. And we have a really strong community as a result of it. So I think some of those things need to happen contextually first before we can even start talking about how can we get these books in school. We have to understand, once they're in the building, how do we actually teach them so that we're not perpetuating harm on students who look like Zainab and I.
So true. And my idea was every teacher read a book themselves, right? Before you bring it in, really spend time. I love I was wondering, as you were presenting on the every kid writing the one poem next to their poem they read, and if they wrote about their own identity, have we so marginalized kids that some of them wouldn't write about their identity? They would create something that would still protect them. And I'm afraid I'm asking that because I believe it's true, that we have to do more work to make all kids visible and seen, not just by other students, but by us. Those things break my heart that colleagues have said to you. I know that Zainab's got a class coming in soon, and we need to wrap this up. Do we have any, like, I could talk to the two of you for hours.
Forever.
And I
just
definitely want to go to your workshop.
I want to commend both of you, and I want to commend Saucin for being so bright with a cat tail in her face the entire time. As I had to step out to let my dog out of the office too. So, but I really, what a treat this has been, and I hope it spurs teachers to start with some of the books that you guys have talked about.
Mhm.
We have a 30-day of Arab Voices blog post going on. This is our first year, and we hope to make it an annual tradition. Zainab's voice is in there. She did a beautiful piece about her name and about her culture. We have some authors in there as well. We have Huda Fahmi's in there, Sahad Mustafa, Beauty in Her Face, which is another great book. Beauty of Her Face is in there. So we have some really great writers, and that's going to be archived and hopefully a resource as well that teachers can pull smaller pieces from and use in their classrooms.
Great.
You guys, thank you so much. We will link resources you send us and absolutely the blogs that are going on, and just have a perfectly wonderful day. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much for your
Thank
time
you.
and for giving us space to speak. This speaks volumes. So thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.